Okay guys, why don't we get started? It's Friday, you guys made it through the week. Monday, there's no school, we have vacation. And on that note, I want to talk about the very first note I have up there. There are no labs next week, so don't show up at the lab. I'll be there, but please don't show up at the lab. Okay, I'll sort of redirect you. So which means that the lab write-ups are not due next week, they're due the week after, before lab of your whatever day you are, your respective day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday. Okay? We cool with that? All right, second thing is I have my Friday shirt on. It is the coolest shirt in here. You guys, your shirts suck. No, it's Friday. Come on, guys. Let's have, it's good. We made it, all right? All right. So, any questions? You guys have all been out to the field at this point. Some of you have been a little bit more or less disappointed about the soil, but that is actually a pretty cool soil. You had an easy time digging. You might have had a harder time finding those horizons, but are you guys getting sort of the idea about what's out there? Okay, we're starting to talk about these horizons. We're starting to be able to describe them. Okay, now I'm going to use that as sort of the segue as to what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be finishing off soil forming factors, and we're going to be starting in on soil forming processes. Okay, so the factors are those variables that change across the landscape that are the architecture or the basis for what the soils or from which the soils are made, how they're made from, and what they're made from. Okay, so you were out there this week, and we basically talked about two parent materials. Okay, I'm going to sort of go through all the soil forming factors. Okay, so what were the parent materials that were there? We've got a sand deposit. It's coming as a stream deposit off of the glacier. That's your first parent material. The second parent material was this loess deposit that was put on top of it. Okay, now how they got there is important, but from the soil's perspective, how it is formed, what's important is how it's arranged in that space and what it is. Does that make sense? Okay, how it's arranged in space, good example there is the stratification of the sands. Okay, that sand as a stream delta was not dumped as a bucket. It was dumped year after year after year in strata laid by each of the floods. Does that make sense? Then we had a loess event afterwards. Okay, the wind particularly, it selectively picked up the silt and rearranged it across the landscape. There was silt in that deposit prior to the loess deposit, but the wind blew through. It basically selectively picked up the silt across the entire landscape and then redistributed it by putting it on the top. Okay? The silt came from the landscape, and then it just got picked up and redeposited. So we basically had an accumulation, or actually I should say first, we had a selective loss of silt in this material that was there, and then we had a selective addition of silt on the top. Does that make sense? Okay, then what happened? Well, we had climate on top of that. Okay, temperature and moisture. It took that silt cap and basically started to weather it away, producing smaller particles that became clay, clay-sized. Those clay, because of the moisture, the rainfall that's around here, the clay moved through the profile and was deposited farther down, alluviated farther down. And that was where those BTs were formed. Seems straightforward? All of that story basically comes from where I'm creating it, in essence, basically out of the soil forming factors. And I will be talking about the soil forming processes, and a lot of that story is basically additions, losses, translocations, transformations, and those are the processes. And you'll be introduced to those today. Okay, questions? Did we feel good about, I'm not going to ask if you had a good time, but did everybody have, did they get something out of that pit? Granted, some of you got more or less, but you're starting to get the idea, right? Yes? No? Sort of? Okay, don't answer the question. I understand. Okay, so where we stopped was was right here. Okay, so about parent material, we talked about climate, and we talked about biota. So let's start talking about the soil forming factor of relief, or topography. Okay, where something is in the landscape and how it's arranged. Okay, So relief basically can determine the effective amount of precipitation as well as soil destruction. And the classic example that they show is this one right here. Okay? So if I have a profile, these are 3 different profiles at 3 different points in the landscape. One is at the summit, one's on the sort of the shoulder back slope, and one's at the foot. Okay? Each one of these has a different profile. So this is an A horizon, E horizon, a B, a C. This is an A, B, C. And this is a very deep A with a B and a C. Okay. Explanation. Why is this? Why do we have these? Why do we have this profile here versus here versus here? Well, gravity happens, right? Imagine we have a rain event, okay? And it rains evenly across this entire landscape. Now, some of that rain is going to do what? It's going to infiltrate into the soil. Some of it's not, though. Okay? The flatter the landscape, the more water I'm probably going to have infiltrate into the soil. Does that make sense? Okay, so at the top, I have a fairly flat landscape. Some of that water, or most of that water, or much of that water is going to infiltrate in to the soil. Not all of it, though. Some of it's going to start flowing downhill. Soils that are here, it rains here as well. Some of that water is going to infiltrate. But because of the slopes that are here, potentially more of that water is going to be overland flow and start moving down slope. Ultimately, we're going to get to the bottom of this hill. It's going to be raining just as much as it is up there. So I'm going to get all that delivery of water. But I'm also going to be getting the delivery of water that's flowing downhill. Which means, while my actual precipitation across this entire landscape is the same, my effective precipitation is a lot less up here than it is down here. And in fact, it's a lot less here than here. Well, why? Well, more of it's infiltrating here than here. Yes, more of it's being delivered this way, but most of that's basically going right through the system and being delivered down here. Now, if moisture is one of the soil forming factors, just by modifying my relief, I've modified moisture. And the response is, look at my horizons. Very different horizons. Up here, I have a moderately thick A. I also have an E horizon, which means the water's moving through and stripping stuff. Here, very thin A horizon, no E horizon, and a B horizon. Well, why? I'm not getting enough water to move through this system to potentially strip those E's. Yes, I still have a B horizon, but not much. This stuff comes down, nice thick A horizon. Well, why? I'm getting overland flow here, which means I'm getting a lot of erosion. I'm also seeing a lot of accumulation here. Where is it going? Those A's are getting really thick. Still have my B horizon, but I don't have an E. Thoughts as to why? I'm definitely getting infiltration in here. It's standing water. It's not getting leached. Why is it not getting leached? I got standing water here. The system isn't going through. It's perched there. Does that make sense to everybody? That's just the relief controlling something else, controlling another factor, in this case, water. Does that make sense? Go. Question.
Can you expect to see like a lateral leaching line along the slope?
Yes. And in 2 weeks, you guys are going to meet that. Often, this water will come down, hit some kind of barrier in here, and it will start moving laterally below ground. And so as a result, you can have an E horizon that's not formed from water going down, but you can have an E horizon that's formed from water going this way. Follows whatever that impervious surface is right on down. Now, as a result, you potentially can get E horizons on these back slopes, shoulders. But that's a little bit more complicated example, so I wanted to keep it simple. Does that make sense to everybody? The next soil that you meet is the Marden soil. Okay, it's got a feature and it's called the fragipan. It's a B horizon with a really dense makeup. Okay, and we'll explain how it comes, how that makeup arises. But it's got a fragipan. The fragipan is basically what we call a subscript X, so it's a BX horizon. That BX horizon's anywhere between a foot and 3 feet down. You can certainly imagine if the water comes in here, it's going to hit that BX, start going sideways. And it does. And you will see these E horizons basically follow the contour of the land straight down. Okay, questions about this one? Okay, that's the redirection of water. Let's use this second example down here. If you are in the northern latitudes, okay, this is north. This would be north. That's south. Okay, we're in the northern latitudes. Okay, we tend to find shallower soils on the northern sides of the slopes. Okay, so here's my hill. Okay, here's the sun. Okay, deeper soils on the south, shallower soils on the north. The first and most obvious reason that you can think of here is that the C10 rule. You guys remember the C10 rule? As things get hotter, reaction rates increase. Okay? Well, if I'm in the northern latitude, the sun is shining more directly on the southern slopes than the northern slopes. The northern slopes are shadier. They're cooler. As a result, I'm getting more heat on this end, so I'm going to have more processing, more chemical reactions, which means I'm going to have more soil genesis, potentially leading to thicker soils. Now, this is not always the case, because if these soils are hotter, they're also going to be drier, which means I'm going to have wetter soils over here. Now, if I have wetter soils over here and drier soils over here, that's going to reflect two things. One is I'm going to have more moisture over here for chemical reactions to occur with, but I'm also going to have different biota communities, potentially. And if I have different plant species on this side than this side, those plants could be interacting with the soil differently. But in general, around here, the southern side of the slopes, the soils are deeper than on the northern side. Does that make sense? Okay, I'm going to throw a couple sort of graphs at you, or not graphs, pictures at you, so you can sort of see some of this. First one's this. Out west, can you guys see that slide fairly well? Looks great on this screen. Do you guys see we got a lake down here. We've got a sort of conal landscape here. We got a ridge coming out. The ridge is going around and it's creating sort of a bowl. Okay, where's the vegetation? Sort of in this zone. This is the confluence zone where if it rains in this bowl, where is all the water going to be concentrated? Straight down into this source area right here. I get more vegetation there, and certainly in the fall, I'm going to have more organic matter. Where do you guys think the deeper or the more developed soils are? Right in here. Does that make sense? Now, does anybody drive down 17? Going to the city or something like that every once in a while? Take the bus or drive down there? There's a series of these sort of concave or bowl-shaped valleys. And around here, it's a lot wetter than out west. And it turns out if you look at these sort of bowl-shaped valleys, this area is dominantly deciduous trees. And these areas are dominantly evergreens, just because of the shape of the relief. Now, in both cases, I've got plants, but I have very different plants. And one would expect that I have different types of soils because I have different types of plants. Does that make sense? Okay, it's most obvious when you're driving down there in the wintertime because the deciduous stuff has shed its leaves. But you'll see these bands. Questions? How about we throw this one in there? Now, I throw this in here because it directly juxtaposes this bottom slide here. Okay, in this case, we're not looking at the slope this way. We're looking at the slope this way. Okay, Baja. Farther south. Looking at that slide, which is the northern slope? This side or this side? Okay, so north is that way. Okay, because this is facing north. This is facing south. Does Does that make sense to everybody? In fact, that is correct. Now, I just said right here, if I got a southern facing slope, I'm generally going to have deeper soils. This is a good example of where it's not the case. Why? It's wetter on this side. What else? If it's wetter on that side, what else am I getting in this scenario? Less direct sun, but what are all these things? Got more vegetation in there, right? If I got more vegetation, the vegetation obviously is holding the soil, but the vegetation is also adding organic matter. So I have a direct addition. I got organisms in there that are forming acids. They're basically building soil. This side, yes, there's some vegetation. Okay, so while I want you to keep this in mind, I want you to realize that some of these trends, there are very real things that happen on the landscape that can potentially change this trend. This is a generalization. You've got to always think about that specific site. And in this case, if you look at the site, it makes sense. Moisture, more organic matter, less stress on the plants. Yes, this side is hotter, but the benefit on this side is that I get more organic matter. Make sense? Questions? We good with this? All right, let's move on. The last one is time. And you guys have heard me say this before. I'm going to say it one more time. You give me a weak acid and a million years, and I will weather away anything. Well, the same holds true. This is what time is all about. Okay? Soil formation rates are too slow for us to measure directly. Okay? But we can estimate the ages of material. We have a lot of different sort of tools. We can use carbon-14 dating. We can also look at historic events, and we can date it based on remnant materials, so volcanic ash layers. Or, in fact, we can look at dateable artifacts. You know, we know that there was this thing here, there was a fire here, or a forest fire, or a building fire, or something like that. And then we can basically measure down to where that is, and we could say, okay, here's the ash line. I've got this much soil, and this ash line occurred here. It took me 100 years to get to here. Does that make sense? Or Krakatoa blew. Or we have cesium tests from the nuclear age. Okay, I can find that layer where the cesium is, and I can see how much accretion I have on top of it, and that's how much soil was developed in that period of time. Okay? The question comes, though, what in fact is time zero? Okay, let's go back to that cesium or the forest fire. Okay, I've got a layer in my soil of cesium. Okay, and then I have this much accretion above it. I can easily say that I grew my soil this much, or my soil developed this much in that time period, but there was a lot of soil before that. Does that make sense? Cesium is just a marker for that time spot, that time in the, that reference point. Time is very relative. At what point did this soil start? And then throw another added component on it. If any of these other five soil forming factors, the other four, changes sometime during that timeline, the development of my soil is going to change direction. Does that make sense? So I could have a soil that started as a sandbank and has been processing for thousands of years into one direction, and then all of a sudden something changed. A different organism moved in. A climate changed. The direction of my soil could totally change. Or it could totally stall. Or it could totally accelerate. That rate of generation can totally change based on these other factors. Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah? Okay. Here's a graph that's right out of your book. And basically what we're looking at is time. And this is relative time, i.e. zero time and how many years it takes to get to something. Now, this is just sort of conceptual. Nobody's been around 100,000 years to have actually mapped this. Okay? But imagine we start with unweathered rock. Okay? The first 100 years or so, we're going to start seeing the evolution of an O horizon. Well, why? The first organisms that are moving into here are going to be plants. Okay? And they're going to start weathering away stuff. But most importantly, they're going to be dropping stuff. And that stuff is going to decompose, and I'm going to start developing an O horizon. Does that make sense? Okay, well, as that stuff starts to decompose, someplace around here, I'm going to start producing a recognizable sea horizon. Now, the production here, you got to remember, C is undifferentiated parent material. I'm not actually producing it, but I'm starting to see it because the rock material itself is just sort of wearing away. Okay, I'm also going to start producing an A horizon. If I have the mineral material, the mineral rock material that I'm seeing from the sea, that is going to start mixing with that O horizon through biological activity, and I'm going to have a horizon, the A horizon, a mineral horizon with the maximum amount of biological activity, maximum amount of organic material. Given time, we're going to start seeing those organic acids start to show up, and we're going to start seeing things move through these old C's and A horizons, and we're going to start seeing E horizons develop. The A horizons are going to start getting thicker, and we're going to start seeing some accumulation below. And those are those BWs. You guys remember the BWs? Weak color or structural development. The first sign of development in these B horizons. This horizon, this sort of younger material, this active material is going to get thicker and thicker and thicker. The C is going to get deeper. The R is going to be slowly weathered away. And we're going to start seeing more developed B horizons, more mature development. T's, accumulations of clays, accumulation of carbonates, oxides, colors, development of blocky structures as we get older. Ultimately, these soils are going to get really old, up to 100,000. That's not really old, actually. We're going to have very well developed O's and A's, fairly thick E's, thick B horizons, C's that are very deep, and the R's are basically out of the picture. Conceptually, that's the sort of the flow that we're expecting to see. Does that make sense? Go.
Is this also something you could observe like on the side of a mountain? Not a mountain like here, but like a mountain with like no trees on it.
Yeah, but what we call these, this is called a chronosequence, a sequence of time. I think in that case you'd basically be looking at an elevation sequence, and it would in a sense mimic this, because as you go up that hill slope, you're certainly going to see, well, you're going to still see water there, but as you go farther and farther down the slope, you're going to get more and more water. But you're also going to see elevation change with temperature, so temperature is going to get cooler. So in essence, what you're seeing is a space-time substitution, where here they all the same, they all have the same rock. We're imagining the same mountain, the same rock, okay? But we're looking at different rates of change for that rock. As you move farther up, you're going to get slower and slower rates of change. Now, also, as you move farther up, potentially you have elevation changes with slope, and you might have erosion. And certainly at the bottom, the very bottom, everything that's coming down is going to accrete here. So that's not really a space-time substitution. That's a little bit different because it's getting... But in essence, you're seeing the same thing. You can imagine this is a mountainside. This is the bottom of the mountain. That's the top of the mountain. There's another question. Go.
For this one, the only parent material is the bedrock. So like other factors. Like
And in this, we're simplifying or just making it one parent material. In this case, it's this R. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It makes it simple. What? Well, the C would develop from this material. The R is going to break up. Okay. Now, I know we've made this, and I said this out in the field. C, by definition, should be unaltered. There should be no genesis whatsoever. But the reality is we see roots in it all the time. There are geologic reasons why things break up. Okay. Now, granted, they're not necessarily soil forming what we would think of as soil forming factors, but they are, in fact, soil forming factors. Okay. So these C's can, in fact, be formed from the R, and soils can then be formed on them. Okay. What process you want to call this C, the reality is it's a soil forming factor. Does that make sense to everybody? Kind of ish? Not a single nod. Okay, all right. Everybody's going, no. All right, makes sense so far? Okay, so let's take a look at some soils. And basically what I've done is there's a little bit farther. I haven't gone all, I mean, you can continue this quite some way, where you start losing B's and E's and the E's disappear. But what I've done is I've sort of pseudo-replicated this transect with some real soils. Okay, so here's that fresh deposit. Now this is not rock, this is basically sand. Okay, fresh deposit all the way up to the top, there's not really that big of a change. Okay, this would basically be considered sea material. Okay, we're starting to see that sea material here, but we're starting to see some formation up at the top. Now this is agricultural land, so there's no O forming, but you can see the A up at the top, and you can see the beginnings of BW in here. Okay, a series of different C's, but you can see the lots of rocks, and it's starting to get some brown up at the top. A little bit farther along, we still have that A and that BW, but we're starting to see a zone here of loss, this E, with accumulations below. You see how those horizons are getting thicker and deeper. Okay, we continue this. Not much bigger than that. An A, E is farther up. The BW has sort of disappeared. BT, nice thick accumulation of the T horizon with the C farther down. Okay, ultimately, you can start seeing these reds that are developing in here. These reds are those oxides. Okay, ultimately, we're going to get to these really deep red horizons. These are the oxysoils. These are those old soils. We haven't talked about oxysoils yet, but we're talking about soils that have basically, all the mineralogy, all these rocks and everything that's in here have basically been weathered away and replaced with secondary minerals. And those secondary minerals happen to be rich in iron, and so as a result, they're red. Does that make sense? Sort of a gradual transect. Go. Why does the E move from below to further up? In this case, it's just an issue. First off, it's two different soils. But in this case, it's basically an issue of more weathering. Okay? That BW is slowly being stripped away as well, and it's being moved farther down. Okay? So down into this scenario. Does that make sense? So as a result, the E is moving up. Now, the reality is that E could be moving down. In fact, that E could be getting thicker. You know, I just happen to pick these pictures. There's no real causative reason why, other than age. Go.
So everywhere in the book, it generally depicts the soil profile going A, B, C.
Uh-huh.
But in reality, the E can be.
The E can be in a lot of different places, but it's always going to be above a zone of accumulation. Okay. Even that example that I showed before, or I talked about before, where you have lateral flow, you're still having some accumulation below. Okay. The E there has to be some sort of evidence of this moving someplace. Go.
So how can there not be a B above a B? If a B is the zone of accumulation?
How can there not be a B above a B?
An E above a B, like in the first one?
It depends on what that accumulation is. Okay. A B, when we say accumulation, it could be something that has developed in that place, and that's like a BW, where color and structure have developed in that location. Unlike this BT, where we're looking at a translocation of clays. Okay? Does that make sense? You can have a B without an E. You can't necessarily have an E without a B. Okay? And there's a couple of examples where you can, in fact, have that, but it usually has to do with some sort of destruction of something or other. Okay, whether it's man-made or otherwise. Does that make sense? Okay, go.
When I was in Africa, is this why most of the earth there is red because it's older? But then I understood that the older it is, the deeper the sea will be. But then there, we would dig and we would hit rock after, I don't know, a foot.
A foot or so? Yeah, so the question is, I'm thinking, this, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but the question is, when she was in Africa, she's basically looking at these soils develop, and if we're thinking about these soils, one would imagine that this material would get deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper as things weather away. Yet, they start digging and they find rocks fairly shallow. There'll be a couple questions. I mean, I don't know if you know the answer to this, but the questions are they truly rocks, or are they concretions that are associated with this material? Or are they just rocks that are really resistant to weathering and everything else around it is big? Did you see these same colors?
I mean, it was red.
Pretty red? It might not have been, this is an oxysoil, but it could have been, there's ultisoils that a younger phase of this. sort of in between here and here, that there are still some rocks in some of these materials. You know, those rocks could, I mean, a lot of potential explanations as to those rocks. What?
They're very porous and will break up easily.
Yeah, so that makes me think that these rocks are resistant to weathering. But after a couple 100,000 years, I mean, you can go down to Pennsylvania and you can basically have a rock and you can basically stick your finger in it and pull it out. You know, we call it saprolite. You know, it's a rotten rock. It still has the shape of a rock, but basically the whole structure of that rock has been weathered away. And you can so if nobody's dug in this spot before, you can sort of see the artifact of where that rock was. Okay, and then you dig into it. It's sort of like, did some of you guys see the fence post that we saw this week? Somebody had put a fence post in that Arkport soil. Okay, the fence had either been pulled out or had rotted away, but you could still see where that fence post was because things had filled in. Okay, it's the same sort of feature that's going to be happening here with this rock. In that case, the interior of that rock is basically rotted out. It's weathered away. And you got this sort of saprolitic rock. But if you could basically take your finger and punch it, or take your hands and just break it apart, that is indicative that that rock was from that location and it's just being weathered away. Just happened to have been a little bit more resistant than everything else. Do we feel good with this so far? Go. We haven't talked about that at this point, but the T, it's the BTs that you guys have met. Those are the accumulations of clays. The X is a fragipan, X, that dense, and you're going to meet those in about 3 weeks. The B here is probably it's been buried or something like that. Something has happened over time. Okay, these are a series of slides that are basically from University of Minnesota. And basically, we're looking at a spotosoil. Okay? This is a space-time substitution. Obviously, nobody's been around 10,000 years to have been able to take these pictures. But what they've done is they've taken pictures of spotosoils that are basically the same location, general location, and they've basically taken a look at different ages. Okay? Different ages of development. Okay? So here is 2,200 years ago-ish. Okay? And we're basically looking, you can see you can certainly see the O's and A's at the top. You can start seeing that A development, and you can start seeing some washes of red down here. Okay, you go to the other extreme, and you can see the full development 10,000 years ago. But you can see this progression. You can see how it started out pretty washed out. The E is definitely there. E, more development, more development, more development. You can see the reds filling in. And then you can see the reds filling in. And in this case, you can start seeing the organic acids coming in from above, stripping through and really establishing that E horizon. That's basically that progression, 7,500 years. Does this make sense? I mean, it's pretty. I think it's a fairly good illustration of what we're talking about here. The processes start, weak expression, or fairly weak expression. Give it a couple more thousand years, pretty strong expression. Go.
Where do you go to get a successional band like this?
Around here, we'd probably go to the Adirondacks. I'm not sure where they went. Probably in the the 1,000 Lakes or 10,000 Lakes area. But basically, you can look at these soils. You can sort of, I find the same sort of features landscape-wise. I just try to date it. Okay, the reality is this could be the same age as that. This spot just happened to be more intense. Now they were able, and I'm not sure how they dated these, but they were able to date these. Maybe C14 or something like that. Okay, any other questions on this? We feel good? All right, so we're going to take a step back now. We're going to move away from the soil forming factors, and we're actually going to start talking about the processes that produce this change. Okay, the factors are the conditions from which the soils form. The processes are the things that act on those conditions to produce the soils. No yawning. Okay. Is that a hand? No? Oh, just stretch. Okay, soil forming processes versus factors. There are 4 processes: addition, losses, translocations, and transformations. And we're going to go through all 4 of these. Okay? Additions. Here's the whole slide. You've seen this slide before, but here's this slide that sort of shows the direction and flow. Okay? Additions, they can come in from above, they can come in from below, they can come in from the side. Certainly imagine organic matter coming in from above, but you also can have water coming in from above. You also can have water coming in from below, or it could literally be coming in downslope. You know, this is an upslope position and it's moving into the soil. Losses are basically the same thing. I could have erosion basically stripping stuff off, but I also could have leaching. And I can have leaching going straight down, but it also could be going downslope. I'm also going to have translocations. Things are going to move through the soil. Okay? Organic matter moving down through earthworms. Clay stuff moving down through alluviation, being entrained in water. Okay? I also can have transformation, where something stays at that one location and is transformed into something else. The easiest one of that to think of is organic matter. Okay? Organic matter decomposes. It's no longer a leaf. It now becomes biomass, and that biomass dies. Or it becomes a leaf, it gets eaten, and it gets cast. Okay? Those are transformations. You can also have mineral transformations. And you guys have heard me start talking about secondary minerals when we were talking about parent materials. Mineral transformation is literally mineral 1 gets changed into another mineral through chemical weathering into mineral 2. Still in the same location. Okay? Seems pretty straightforward? Let's start with additions. Okay, additions, the dramatic additions that we usually talk about are organic matter, deposition of plant material, but we also have solutes, so salts moving through a system. Certainly think of out west where we're looking at groundwater bringing salts into a system. Okay, we also can have sediment, whether it's water deposited or aerial deposit. Okay, wind deposition, that's what those lusses were on top of the arc ports. Okay, wind is moving things in. Okay, I have a whole list of stuff here, and that's on your slide and on your PDFs. But we're basically a lot of different type of examples. Okay, good addition that usually people don't think about is gas. Gas coming into the system, CO2 or oxygen, okay, as well as all the other gases, nitrates and things like that, that potentially can be coming in either as dissolved in water, but also as a gas. Okay. Some good examples. Yesterday we started talking, we've been talking about lust with everybody out in the field, and I threw these slides in here, I guess last year, because there was sort of this question, well, actually how much material is actually being moved? Okay, and the question came up again yesterday, one of the days. I mean, really, how much material are we talking about? Okay, this is pictures from the Dust Bowl. This is archival stuff from the Library of Congress. But here you can see these cars down here, and this is a big, huge dust cloud. Okay, here's the truck basically taking off, you know, and driving down the road, and you can see this big, huge dust cloud. Here is the deposition of that material. Okay, that's a house, basically buried under loess. Now, this was an anthropogenic source material. This stuff was due to human activity. Now, imagine how much larger scale of an event we're talking about when the glacier's doing this. The glacier's moving through, it's basically creating all of this mixed material, and then it's leaving. Vegetation hasn't had a chance to stabilize any of this stuff, and I have this cold ice cube up there, and I've got this hot body of land down there. You're going to create a lot of convection currents, and these convection currents are going to selectively pick up this stuff, and it's going to deposit it. That's why you have 50 meters of stuff in parts of China and in the Midwest. Around here, you have smaller depositions, but it's everywhere. Now, granted, it has been reworked since vegetation and humans have moved into the system, but that's where that lust comes from. Does that make sense? Now, go. Lust is a wind silt deposit. Okay? Now, This I'm portraying, this is as an addition, but it's very easily could be portrayed as a loss as well. Here are some more additions. Here's a road that's basically been buried. Now this is an addition not through wind, but this is a water addition. Okay, here's another, you can't actually see, can you guys actually see the writing? This is an A horizon, this is a B horizon, this is a buried A horizon, and there's a question mark on whether this is a B horizon. So what are we looking at here? A mudslide. This actually happens to be a water deposition event, but this was a soil, and then it got buried by material, and a new soil formed on top of it. That's a rather dramatic addition, but they are all pretty dramatic. Now, the pictures I showed you, the reality is that most of it's coming in very small dribs and drabs, but it is an addition. This is just an extreme example. Here's another example. I don't know if you really can pick this one out, but actually I don't even know where I got this slide. But there's a soil horizon here that's basically an A, and then you've got deposit of stuff, and then you've got this huge, this is all loess that's been basically deposited on top. So that, just to give you another example of how deep these soils are formed on this loess. This is the Midwest. Okay, the rounded stuff down here, this is obviously sort of water distributed material if it's rounded rocks. Okay, I got a soil that formed on top of it. I got a little bit more rounded rocks, and then basically starting right here, up, it's all loess. Here's another addition event. Here's an A horizon. The B signifies that it's buried. Okay, an A horizon was formed down here, and then I got a C, and then an AP at the very top. The AP, that plow layer. See all this strata? Flood after flood after flood after flood. Okay, remember the arc ports that you saw? This is the type of stratification that we're seeing. Fine, coarse sands, all strata based upon how strong the flood event was. Go.
So it still counts as a C, even though it was like put there in strata? Like I thought the C was like untouched.
The C is untouched by soil genesis. Okay, remember when we talked about the parent material, I don't have that slide in this section, but the parent material can be transported, and there's a variety of different ways of transport. The transport in this case happens to be alluvial, alluvial water. Does that make sense? All right, so we have additions, we can have losses, and this slide is basically the same slide as I showed you before with a change of losses at the top. Because anything that brings something as an addition can also take something away as a loss. All right, so we have the sediment lost by erosion. We have solutes leaching to groundwater. We have organic matter basically lost to oxidation, decomposition rates. Okay, and then the whole slew of little examples that I won't go through. But I could every slide that I just showed you, I could basically use as a loss slide. Because all that material came from someplace else. Okay? Most dramatic is this slide right here, but basically we're looking at a gully. The soil is basically up at the top there, going all the way down to the sea material. All this red material is weathered material, and these guys are basically mining it. They're backing the truck up into the gully, helping the gully along, But that's a loss. Erosion events here, basically taking the field away. You can see these sinks. The sinks and the slides, sinks and slides, sinks and slides. Some of these can be rather dramatic, where we have sort of flood events. I'll stop there. So, questions on that one? Does that make sense? Anything that you can have as an addition, you can have as a loss. Wind, water, gas, worms, it all happens. Okay? All right. We good with additions and losses? Let's start moving to translocations. Okay, translocation is a material moving from one part of the soil to another part of the soil. This is not coming from another soil. It's coming from within the soil. On top of the soil, moving downward, the bottom of the soil moving upward or side to side. Okay? The The classic one that we give examples of are these salts. This is why I gave the example of the Man Library Tunnel. You go over there, you see salts, the water moves into the system, the salts get dissolved in the water, and then the salts move with the water, and then when the water evaporates, the salts are left behind. The salts aren't changed, they're dissolved, but they're still the same salts as they started with where they get there. Okay? So certainly in the human environments, all the salts, because we have enough delivery of water, the salts are basically going to be washed out of the soil system. But as the system gets drier, that water comes in, it doesn't necessarily make it to the groundwater, it potentially comes back up. Okay? And at this point, if you have evapotranspiration, plants are going to start sucking up this stuff as well. The salts are going to start accumulating. Now in really dry environments, those salts, the water comes in, it dissolves the salts that are in here. The water comes down and then basically turns around. It's not going to make it to the groundwater because of evaporation and capillary action. The water is going to come right back to the surface and be gone. I mean, it's going to evaporate, and the salts are going to be left behind. The drier the system, the higher the salts are going to be. In fact, they're going to come right to the surface. Now, added into this fact, with the salts, also think about additions. I have a landscape that's bowl-shaped. Okay? Rains everywhere. I've got salts everywhere. But over the years, those salts are going to start accumulating down at the bottom of my bowl. Because it's going to be raining, the rain is going to dissolve the salts and it's slowly going to move it farther and farther and farther down. Think of Salt Lake City. Think of the Great Salt Lake. Okay. Here's some examples. These are the extreme examples of salt, basically salt formation. This is basically the salt pans. You can see it's dramatic. The salt's all the way up to the surface. Okay? But these salts can actually accumulate around here as well when we over-fertilize or we over-salt. Look at the sidewalks in the springtime. Okay? All along Cornell. Now, Cornell sprays the salt so that people don't slip and sue them. Okay? But that salt is going to move someplace. Now, you guys, when you go up and down Tower Road, you notice how the sidewalks, there's the grass on either side of the sidewalk kind of like not there. Okay? Now, there's two reasons why that grass is really not there. One is that we walk on it, but two is there's a lot of salts that are coming off from the salting of the sidewalks. That salt gets into the soil, and it makes it very hard for the plants to come back. Okay? But that's what's going on here. Okay? This is still a salt accumulation at the surface, but we're starting to see salts like this around here because of over-fertilization and salting. Here's another translocation. Now, I focus mostly on the salts here, but you can certainly imagine that other things will translocate. You guys saw them this week. What horizon is a horizon of translocation? The BT horizon, right? Clays came from the top. They weathered from up there, so that was a transformation as well. But they turned into clays up here, and then the clays got entrained in the water and moved farther down and got put into those BT horizons, right? Okay, well, here's a really cool slide that sort of shows you that. What we're looking at is a sand grain right here under polarized light. Okay, so the light is basically shining one direction. Okay, and you're seeing, see all these sort of lines here? That's the clay coating the sand grain. Okay, the clay, you can tell that this is translocation because the clay, to have coated this like this, has to have moved into that location and made a sort of paint job over it. Okay, here's another sort of slide of the same thing. This is a larger scale, so these are the same sort of sand grains as you're seeing up there. Okay, but you can see the oriented minerals in there. Those oriented minerals are the clays. This is what those BTs were like. If we had taken some samples of those BTs, the sand was still there. I mean, when you guys textured those, you felt the sand, right? Okay, the sand is not disappearing when the clay is moving in. The clay is just filling in all those cracks. And we have that accumulation of clay. Now, remember my story about how those BTs, if I did a stop action photography, it would look like they're moving up? Okay, imagine here's that horizon. Okay, the clays are coming down and clogging sand that's up here, but ultimately the water is going to work its way down through here, and these clays that are at the bottom are going to be weathered away. Okay, but they're always going to be oriented, and that's what we're seeing. Great example of translocation, and actually a rather pretty one. Okay, questions about this one? Then let's start talking about transformations. Okay, transformations, predominantly we're talking about clay formation, but we also going to be talking about organic matter. And the example I have to show you is an organic matter one. But we're looking at mineral alteration in place. I have a rock. Okay, it's a very small one, so it's a clay-sized rock, but I have a rock. Okay, to that rock, I add water, and I change the temperature, and I put some organic acids in there. What's going to happen to that rock? It's going to start dissolving, right? I mean, that's that weak acid in a million years sort of story. Okay, if it's dissolving, the rock is still there. Some of it's leaving, but it's being transformed because the rock is being dissolved selectively. Certain things are going to be dissolved first, which means that rock is changing, and it's changing in place. Okay, now it happens to be a clay particle, a clay mineral. It basically changes from one mineral to another. Mineral alteration in place, translocation, or transformation. Make sense? Yeah? We also can have scenarios, and this is what you're going to see in 2 weeks. We can also have a translocation event that then turns into a transformation event. Okay, I've got that rock, remember? Okay, it's a clay particle. I start dissolving it, and things leave it, right? Well, where do all those things that leave it go? Some of the times they're lost from the system. They basically wash out. But sometimes they're just translocated farther down into the system, where they can reform into something else. Okay, so that's a translocation and then a transformation. Does that make sense? Okay, you will see these when we start talking. You won't see them, but you'll be able to see the scenario when we start talking about the Fragipan in 2 weeks when we go up to the Martin, up on the top of Mount Pleasant. Okay, these materials are extremely dense materials. And there's a couple of theories as to how these dense materials arrived. One of these theories is that I have stuff up here that's weathering. It's being solubilized and put into water. Then it's moving down into dense zones. The dense zones stall the water, giving the opportunity for all the stuff that's dissolved in that water to reform into a crystal, making that dense zone even denser. And when we get up there, you're going to see this stuff is really hard to dig through. You're going to be taking a shovel and you're going to be wailing on it. It's that dense. Okay? Do we feel comfortable with this? Questions? No? All right. The one example that I have here is organic matter. This is a Japanese, basically looking at different temperatures. But they start as a fresh material. And as the temperature changes, you can see the transformation. Okay? All right. Congratulations. It's Friday. Guys, have a great weekend. Finish off the day well. And I will see you Monday.